Sherman was able to spend that Christmas with his family in Lancaster, Ohio, before proceeding down the ice-choked Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee. The Confederacy still maintained a force in Mississippi and harassed the Union forces on the Mississippi River. Sherman was determined to put an end to this harassment with a quick campaign to Meridian, Mississippi. On February 3, 1864, Sherman departed from Vicksburg with an army of about 20,000 combined forces, as well as a cavalry of about 7,000 leaving from Memphis. Through a series of fake maneuvers, Sherman fooled the Confederate forces into thinking he was going to take Mobile, Alabama instead. Sherman reached Meridian with virtually no opposition on February 24th. While waiting for his cavalry to arrive, Sherman ordered his troops to wipe the appointed meeting place off the map. Meridian was destroyed and the inhabitants left without any food. However, Sherman's forces did not directly attack the citizens, instead destroying only the infrastructure. Sherman's cavalry from Memphis never arrived, having been driven back at the Battle of Okolona on February 22nd. By March 3rd, Sherman was back in Vicksburg, having marched his army 450 miles in 1 month, subsisting off the land and captured spoils and leaving a path of destruction through central Mississippi. The Meridian Campaign is widely seen as a prelude and training experience to Sherman's future march to the sea. After planning and logistics trips to Cincinnati and Nashville, Sherman reviewed with his generals the coming campaign to capture Atlanta. Sherman wrote that the great question of the campaign was one of supplies. Not only would they have to ship supplies from north to south through hostile territory, it would take legions of men and arms to defend the routes. In addition, as the armies advanced, they would have to repair damaged and destroyed rail lines and guard those as well. Sherman then ordered that rail lines transport only essential military supplies and that everything that could travel by foot or wagon, including troops and cattle, move on their own legs. The citizenry complained furiously, even appealing to President Lincoln himself. Lincoln asked Sherman if he could not modify his orders, to which Sherman politely refused. Sherman calculated that his army of 100,000 men would need 130 10-ton rail cars to reach Chattanooga each day, and then move the same from Chattanooga to the continuously moving front lines. Soldiers, cattle, and horses would move by foot and forage where possible. Sherman then ordered the confiscation of all rail cars and locomotives available. Months later, deep into Georgia, Sherman remarked on how he saw train cars from almost every railroad north of the Ohio River. By the beginning of May, Sherman had prepared his Army of the West to move south against Confederate General Joseph Johnston. In the east, General Grant was ready to move against Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The two-pronged Union assault was designed to break the war machine of the South and end the war once and for all. In his plans, Grant had variously commented to Sherman, alluding to the strategies to come. I propose to move against Johnston's army, and to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can against their war resources. I leave you free to execute it in your own way. You have too much experience in traveling light and subsisting upon the country. Sherman designed his army for rapid and self-sustaining movement. Walled tents were forbidden except as medical tents. Each soldier was required to carry 5 days' rations on themselves, and wagons and pack horses were restricted to a bare minimum. Sherman had even obtained a copy of the U.S. Census tables of 1860, tax records of the state of Georgia, and annotated maps detailing transportation, populations, and resources by county. "12 hours after Grant began moving, Sherman began his Atlanta campaign on May 5, 1864. For the next 2.5 months, Sherman and Johnston fought a series of skirmishes and battles. Johnston established defensive positions, while Sherman, avoiding frontal assaults, simply flanked Johnston and continued south toward Atlanta, forcing Johnston into new defensive positions. From July 5th to the 11th, Sherman's forces advanced and captured the Chattahoochee River crossing at Pace's Ferry, where Sherman crossed the river, now only miles from Atlanta. Sherman now split his army into 3 columns for the assault on Atlanta. By now, Confederate States President Jefferson Davis had become frustrated with General Johnston and appointed General John Bell Hood. Hood, although more aggressive than Johnston, continued with Johnston's strategies. However, Hood too failed to turn the Union advances and suffered large losses at the Battle of Peachtree Creek on July 20th. On July 22nd, Hood's forces advanced on the Union forces. After a series of advances, flanks, and repulses, a main battle line developed near Bald Hill southeast of Atlanta. Union General James McPherson, a favorite of Sherman's, was killed early in the battle. The fighting was brutal and sometimes hand-to-hand. While the Union forces repulsed Hood's attack, the Confederates still held Atlanta, but suffered devastating losses to an already diminished army. Sherman then settled into a months-long siege of the city, making several unsuccessful attempts to cut off supply routes into the city. Finally, Sherman moved in force to cut the rail supply lines near Jonesboro. On August 31st, the Battle of Jonesboro took place, in which Sherman's forces finally cut the supply lines. Hood evacuated Atlanta September 1st after destroying 81 rail car loads of military supplies. Sherman occupied the city the next day. During the campaign, each side suffered over 30,000 casualties, and while Sherman captured Atlanta, he failed to destroy Hood's Confederate Army of Tennessee. But the fall of Atlanta was more than a military victory. Confederate General Johnston himself recognized that simply delaying Sherman and extending the war might give the North's Democratic Party peace movement a chance at the upcoming presidential elections. Even Grant, in his memoirs, commented that Davis blundered in removing Johnston. Anything that could have prolonged the war a year would probably have exhausted the North to such an extent that they might then have agreed to a separation. Instead, Sherman's capture of Atlanta greatly invigorated the North and helped ensure Lincoln's re-election. Sherman then cut off outside trade with the citizens still in Atlanta and ordered that all citizens still remaining to leave the city. Sherman had seen in other captured cities the huge crippling effect on the armies to guard and protect an otherwise hostile population. Sherman wrote to President Lincoln that it was essentially up to the people of Georgia. She can now save herself from the devastations of war only by withdrawing her quota out of the Confederate Army and aiding me to expel Confederate General Hood. Instead of desolating the land as we progress, I will keep our men to the high roads and commons and pay for the corn and meat we need and take. General Hood did correspond with Sherman, his protests of the removal of the population of Atlanta, among other things. The unprecedented measure you propose transcends all acts ever before brought to my attention in the dark history of war. In the name of God and humanity, you will find that you are expelling the wives and children of a brave people. Sherman replied in a long letter back to Hood that he need not look to the dark history of war, but to his own actions and those of other Confederate generals in doing the same thing repeatedly. He then added, "I say that it is a kindness to these families of Atlanta to remove them now, at once, from scenes that women and children should not be exposed to." Hood replied, finishing with, "We will fight you to the death. Better die 1,000 deaths than to submit to live under you or your government and your Negro allies." Sherman replied once more and ended the correspondence with Hood. Sherman wrote that by the middle of September, the infrastructure of Atlanta was working again. The trains ran, communications were restored, and they had ample supplies. General Hood did, however, move back north toward Tennessee to threaten Sherman's supply and communication lines. Sherman and Hood parried back and forth until it became clear that Sherman could not outright defeat Hood with the forces he had, nor fully defend his supply and communication lines. On October 1st, Sherman telegraphed Grant with what was probably as much a statement as a question. "Will it not do for me to destroy Atlanta and march across Georgia to Savannah or Charleston, breaking roads and doing irreparable damage? We cannot remain on the defensive." On October 5th, Hood dispatched Major General Samuel French to attack the small Union garrison at the Allatoona Pass rail line, now defended by Union Brigadier General John Corse. French surrounded the entrenched Union defenders and offered unconditional terms of surrender. "You are surrounded, and to avoid a needless effusion of blood, I call on you to surrender, unconditionally. 5 minutes will be allowed for you to decide." To which Corse replied, "We are prepared for the needless effusion of blood whenever it is agreeable to you." The losses were high on both sides, but the Confederates were unable to dislodge the Union garrison. The Confederates did succeed in tearing up 8 miles of railroad, which required 10,000 men 7 days to repair. Sherman and his armies gained the reputation in the South of actually carrying spare tunnels and bridges along to repair the periodic damage. But when his supply lines were cut, Sherman did not hesitate to strip the local inhabitants of all they had. Sherman explained to one local farmer as he took his sheep, "We preferred Illinois beef, but mutton will have to answer." From October 9th to the 11th, Sherman telegraphed Grant stating, "It will be a physical impossibility to protect the roads. It is useless for us to occupy Georgia, but the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make this march and make Georgia howl." As November opened, Grant was still hesitant to let Sherman march through Georgia and instead wanted Sherman to follow Hood and destroy him. Sherman continued to insist that Hood's plan was to draw Sherman away from Georgia, and following Hood would cause the whole effect of Sherman's Atlanta campaign to be lost. On November 2, 1864, Grant was finally convinced. "I do not see that you can withdraw from where you are to follow Hood, without giving up all we have gained in territory. I say then, go on as you propose." Sherman now had Grant's permission to march. Sherman sent all the sick and wounded back to Chattanooga and prepared his army of 60,000 men to march on an hour's notice. He then destroyed the telegraphs and railroads from Atlanta to isolate the city. On November 12th, Eddie, a telegraph operator, climbed the pole to the last remaining line and contacted Chattanooga. Major General George Thomas replied and wished Sherman great success. Sherman replied simply, "Dispatch received. All right." Sherman's men then burnt the bridge carrying that last wire, and all communications with the North were cut. Sherman and his 60,000 men were now alone, cut off, and heading in the opposite direction of the enemy. With 1,000 miles of hostile territory between him and his final objective, the army marched east with the hope that they would end the war. Sherman issued special field orders to his army. Order number 119 stated, among other things, "Of all things, the most important is that the men during marches and in camp keep their places and do not scatter about as stragglers or foragers to be picked up by the hostile people. At some future time, we will be able to provide for the poor whites and blacks who seek to escape the bondage under which they are now suffering." And Special Field Order number 120. The Army will forage liberally on the country during the march. Soldiers must not enter the dwellings of the inhabitants or commit any trespass. The Corps commanders were given the authority to destroy mills, houses, gins, and other elements of the land that could support the enemy, but within limits. In districts and neighborhoods where the army is unmolested, no destruction should be permitted. But should guerrillas or bushwhackers molest our march, then army commanders should order a devastation more or less relentless. The order also said to take from the rich rather than the poor, refrain from abusive and threatening language towards the locals, and even give written certificates, but not actual receipts, of the items taken. Sherman also addressed that African Americans might follow the march. He allowed that able-bodied African Americans could join the march and be employed in the service of the army. However, while they were not slaves in the army, the fighting men and the march were the priority. On November 14th, Sherman's engineer, Captain Orlando Poe, began his task of destroying Atlanta's structures that might aid the enemy if they took back the city. The structures were destroyed and set afire. At one point, a live Confederate arsenal was caught up in the flames and ignited the ammunition in large explosions, nearly torching the house in which Sherman himself stayed. Unauthorized marauding soldiers also set fire to civilian homes, causing heavy damage. The fire spread and destroyed much of the heart of the city, resulting in the famed burning of Atlanta. The next day, the army marched from Atlanta. Sherman himself left Atlanta the following day. It would be the last time he saw Atlanta. Sherman knew that if this march failed, it would be judged the wild adventure of a crazy fool. The Savannah Campaign, better known today as the March to the Sea, had begun. By the first night, the soldiers were already tearing apart the railroads, burning the ties, and heating the rails to wrap around trees and make Sherman's neckties. Not long after, Sherman visited a plantation house and approached an old gray-haired slave, asking if he understood about the war and its progress. He replied that he did, and that he had been looking for an angel of the Lord ever since he was knee-high, and that slavery was the cause of the war and the Union's success was to be his freedom. Sherman warned him to be patient and not follow the march, as they could not be fed. However, thousands of slave refugees did follow. Able-bodied refugees were put to work clearing and repairing roads as well as other tasks. But other refugees did not or could not work, but followed anyway, seeking freedom, protection, and food, now made scarce by the Army's foragers. Sherman's foragers were successful in supplying the marching army with abundant supplies. So much so that the Army's condition dramatically improved as they moved forward. The march covered from 10 to 15 miles per day, with foragers flanking the columns, cutting a swath as much as 60 miles wide. As they collected supplies, they loaded the spoils into supply wagons without losing their place in the moving columns. Sherman himself did note that unauthorized acts of pillage and violence did occur by the foragers, nicknamed bummers. Sherman wrote that atrocities were rare, but history records many stories of the severe destruction wrought by the bummers. The Confederate forces that did harass the march caught some of these bummers. During the later Savannah and Carolinas campaigns, at least 46 Union soldiers were lynched by Confederate forces. The bulk of these were bummers. On the one hand, the bummers did leave the swath of destruction that Sherman knew would make the Southern inhabitants feel the full ruin of war. On the other hand, history does not record the genocidal atrocities that often occur with campaigns of total war. On November 22nd, Sherman, by coincidence, camped at the home of Confederate General Howell Cobb, former governor of Georgia and a leader of the original secession movement. Upon learning he was camped at Cobb's plantation, Sherman made quick work of confiscating his property and burning the plantation, ordering his men to spare nothing. As they traveled, some elements of Sherman's columns did meet stiff but limited resistance from Confederate cavalry at the battles of Griswoldville and Buckhead Creek, but the Confederates were driven off and did not stop the march. As the columns approached new locations, many of the white locals fled, and Southern newspapers assailed the invaders, imploring the locals to destroy the forage ahead and fight them front, flank, and rear. However, Sherman made it clear to the locals that destroying the forage was tantamount to resistance and rebellion, and would incur his order of full devastation upon them. As word got out, the resistance subsided. On December 3rd, Sherman entered the town of Millen, Georgia, home to a short-lived and recently evacuated Confederate prisoner of war camp holding 10,000 Union soldiers. On December 4th, the Battle of Waynesboro took place, which effectively eliminated Confederate resistance on the last leg to Savannah. That same day, Sherman lost his son Charlie to illness. Charlie was 10 months old. Sherman had never met him. On December 9th, Union soldiers crossed the swollen Ebenezer Creek 20 miles north of Savannah. Upon crossing, the commander dismantled the temporary pontoon bridge, leaving 5,000 refugee slaves behind and at the mercy of Confederate cavalry shadowing the march. Hundreds of refugees attempted to cross the creek, and many drowned. The rest were captured by the Confederates, and their fate remains unknown even today. On December 10th, Sherman reached the outskirts of Savannah and found Confederate Lieutenant General William Hardee entrenched in the city. Sherman sent forces to capture nearby Fort McAllister, which was captured within 15 minutes. This allowed Sherman to contact the Union Navy fleet off the coast beyond the fort. From the fleet, Sherman received new supplies and siege artillery to surround the city. On December 17th, Sherman sent a message to Hardee, warning him that he was surrounded, cut off, and targeted with heavy artillery. Sherman demanded his surrender. "Should I be forced to resort to assault, I shall then feel justified resorting to the harshest measures, and shall make little effort to restrain my army, burning to avenge the national wrong which they attached to Savannah." Hardee did not surrender, but did escape, crossing the Savannah River on a makeshift pontoon bridge. Sherman occupied the city December 21st. Meanwhile, Confederate General Hood's forces were severely routed by Union Major General George Thomas's forces at Nashville, effectively eliminating the threat from Confederate forces in the Western Theater. On December 22, 1864, Sherman sent a message to President Lincoln. "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah." The Savannah Campaign was complete. Sherman had marched his 60,000-man army, cutting a 60-mile wide, 285-mile path of destruction through the very heart of enemy territory. But Sherman was not yet done gutting the Confederacy.